At this point, I'd like to introduce my colleague Ben Jones. Professor Jones, in addition to being not just a strategy professor, but also a researcher in creativity, R&D. How do people generate ideas? How do they get them permeated within the economy? But also a former member of government as a White House fellow a number of years ago, so he is steeped in these topics. To moderate a discussion with Ambassador Ivo Daalder, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, by the way, one of the great global affairs institutions in the United States. I'm a big supporter, and you should be too. And Matthew Bishop, a senior editor from The Economist, and also head of their U.S. business desk. Matthew, and Ivo, and Ben.
Okay, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about the U.S.-Europe relationship. I think a subject which is experiencing a lot more innovation than normal. We just heard about how good it is to do things and roll the dice, and maybe that's not always true in international relations. We can engage that. What I'd like to do is first invite Ivo and then Matthew to just give a few opening comments about the importance of the U.S.-Europe relationship and also the direction they see it heading.
Well, great, thanks. Great to be here. When Rob asked me to talk, I said, this is such a boring topic. But then he reminded me that Donald Trump will be going to Europe before we talk. So I just learned that if you do the same thing for 70 years, you probably need to do it differently going forward. That's what I took away from the previous conversation. And for 70 years, we've had really good U.S.-European relations, so that's, I think, what's happening. We're doing something different. And we are really doing something different. The visit that President Trump made to Europe and what has come afterwards is, I think, a potential turning point. You never really know until afterwards whether you turn the corner. But it is a potential one. It seems to me that the President and his major advisors, and if you don't believe me, just open up the Wall Street Journal today, in which the National Security Advisor and the National Economic Advisor, General H.R. McMaster and Mr. Cohn, lay out what they had achieved in this visit. And they make the point, importantly, that American interest is what really needs to drive American foreign policy. Not American values, but American interest. And that we will have good partners when they pursue our interests, but we will have disagreements when they don't pursue our interests. And those interests are undefined in this piece, and they frankly are in many ways undefined in our foreign policy. For 70 years, the United States has believed and acted upon the assumption that a stable, prosperous, and peaceful Europe is in America's interest. And that the lesson we had learned from the first half of the 20th century, when the United States twice had to cross oceans and fight wars in Europe to defeat enemies in Europe at extraordinary costs in lives and treasure to Americans, that the best way we could have security, peace, and stability in Europe was to be in Europe. Not to wait on this side of the ocean till things went wrong and then get on airplanes, as we could now do, or on ships, and then fight wars, but actually prevent them. And it has been a historically extraordinarily successful effort. Europe that came out of the destruction of World War II, united, became prosperous, stable after the Cold War. Western Europe extended into Eastern and Central and Eastern Europe, and you now had the largest zone of peace, stability, and prosperity anywhere in the world. Extraordinary achievement over 70 years. And our interest, our security, our prosperity, our stability, was fundamentally served by ensuring that Europe remained a place that was at peace, that was prosperous and stable. So the question is, what needs to change, or do we need to change? And that's a legitimate question. And I think the election of Donald Trump, frankly, the election in Great Britain, the referendum on Brexit, and a variety of other things that are happening, put that question foursquare in front of us. But the big change, the biggest one, is a potential reassessment by the United States of a 70-year-old policy that probably has been more successful than anyone who advocated that policy in 45, 46, or 47 thought possible in bringing peace, security, and stability to a part of the world that had been the cause of two major and still the largest world wars we've seen in history.
Thank you, Ivo. Matthew, some opening comments?
Yes, I agree with much of that. I suppose anyone that thinks they have any foresight about where the world is going at the moment, I think I'm slightly sceptical about, because it's really, I think, never been less clear. It's possible that last year Brexit, Trump, was just a blip. Both results were very narrow results. It's possible to imagine Europe getting back on its feet and rediscovering its historic mission again. It's possible to imagine, the news in London last weekend was that the Labour Party is gaining on the Conservatives and they may have a hung parliament, and who knows, what would a hung parliament full of people that largely didn't support Brexit actually do in those circumstances. And then, obviously Trump, Mueller is a very interesting appointment to be a special investigator. Anything is possible out of that. A year's time, the midterm elections may mean there's an already not very competent leader will be completely paralysed in Washington. Who knows again? So we're in a period of tremendous uncertainty geopolitically, and the Europe-America relationship is very much evidence of that paralysis. I suppose I wanted to pick up a couple of themes that I think underlie that. One is, that the European Union was an example of tremendous foresight and innovation coming together. That it won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012, and I think for good reason, because it was a visionary idea that took a part of the world that was always fighting and created the basis for sustained peace. And it was very much Jean Monnet, the French politician, who, during the depths of the Second World War, when he was part of the French government in exile and negotiating with Roosevelt how to get the supply chains to Europe to work effectively, that he had this vision of moving beyond national sovereignty, pooling sovereignty as a way to achieve peace. You look back to America as really the home of modern democracy, and also, so the reason Hamilton is so popular, I think, is we love the idea of ideas being behind the formation of a nation state, an idea about how to live better together. That idea was ultimately reflected again in the Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan and all that after the Second World War, where, again, tremendous idealism about how we could collaborate together beyond our narrow interests just to a larger interest. Great innovative ideas, and I suppose what I feel at the moment is that innovators need to return to the political sphere and think very hard about how do we reinvigorate and innovate around multinational cooperation, because the current global multilateral system is under severe stress and may fall apart if we don't innovate. And also, how do we get a democratic model to innovate as well, given all the social media techniques we have and the ability to operate crowds and curate them in very interesting ways. We have to modernize that system for the 21st century so we don't end up having infantile egocentrics with terrible bad tempers and no knowledge of the world being elected the most powerful person.
Don't hold back, Matthew. Okay, so well, let's dig in. So we have obviously it used to seem a sleepy relationship, in part because we had, I think, alignment on goals as regions, and then there was, of course, a lot of institutions. There's NATO, and then, of course, you have all the Bretton Woods institutions. We have the World Bank, the IMF, we had the Marshall Plan. After the war, a commitment to democracy and free markets and governance, good governance around the world, et cetera, and not only maintaining the relationship between U.S. and Europe, but also trying to promulgate that viewpoint more broadly in the world. Okay, and so now somehow we have this sort of what is going on change on both sides, right? Brexit precedes Trump, neither of which were predicted by the prediction markets. They were both not supposed to happen up to the day before. And one word we use is populism. You could use various words for what's going on, but there's some underlying social forces that are very powerful domestically, politically, right now that are not in concert with that equilibrium that's been going on for so many decades. And I want to, before we get into sort of a little bit on the sources of that, just because I think that might help us think about where it's going, even if it's hard to predict. At some level there was Brexit and Trump, and we were on a new trend. It was a new world, and yet now we've had the Dutch election, we've had the French election. Yesterday the Dutch Parliament actually approved the free trade agreement with Ukraine. Things that seemed impossible or very hard and contentious, we've seen a kind of a swing back now towards more of the globalization norms. So, do you see Trump Brexit as a blip, as a trend? Are we in a lull? 6 months from now, are we going to have more populist electoral victories in Europe, or are we going to sort of be feeling like we're getting more and more back to the prior status quo? Ivo.
So I think we should not just look at the end result. I think you need to look at the trend writ large. And as Matthew said, both Brexit and the US election were very close. In other words, close to 50% in both countries voted for Donald Trump and believed in Brexit. And even it was 60-40 in the other way, you still have a humongous block of people in both societies that basically said the traditional way of doing business no longer accords with what I think is the way forward, and we need to find a different way, change. Didn't know quite what that change meant when you went deep in terms of policy. It's not clear that there was a clear understanding of where to go, but a very clear understanding of what not to accept. And that's true even when you go forward and look at the elections that seem to go in the other way. Yes, it's true that in Holland, country I know quite well, having been born and raised there, the Freedom Party didn't get as much votes as the worst predictions suggested, but it still got 20 out of 150 seats, which is the largest margin it's ever had, and forced the right to move to its direction in terms of policy terms. And in France, you had the largest number of people voting for what is, by any measure, a neo-fascist party. 35% of the country. It's true that only 5% of Parisians voted for Marine Le Pen, but large numbers in southern and northern France, majorities voted for her. And we will see what happens in the elections. We have Italy, where I wouldn't want to predict the outcome of an election coming forward. So we have a trend that I think doesn't translate necessarily in outcomes of elections, but in a large, let's say, minority, is deeply unhappy with the current state of affairs, with the institutional state of affairs, with the alignments that countries have had for many, many years, and frankly with their own political and economic and social plight because of the rate of change that's happening. And I would add to that no politician, as far as I can tell today, has found an adequate answer for these people. Macron, who really is a remarkable political phenomenon as someone who a year ago no one had heard of and is now president of France, made the case on a traditional platform of pro-globalization, pro-EU, pro-market reform, which by the way is necessary in France, but won more because of who he was running against than the other way around. And here in this country, frankly, I think our political debate has demonstrated that we have no answer whatsoever for those voters who decided that the current political alignment is not the right way. Brexit, we are in the middle of a negotiation, is not the answer, we will find out, to this challenge. And this is the driving force. Unless we find a way for people who feel that they have lost out because of change, whether it's because of trade or automation or immigration or a whole combination that leads to the anxieties that are expressed politically, unless we find a way to bring them back into the fold of a political consensus, we're on a road that is deeply troubling and worrisome in terms of the future. That's one foresight. It's a very troubling one, because people who think they have nothing to lose may act in ways like they have nothing to lose, and they are not necessarily the ways that are beneficial for society writ large.
Matthew, do you see a similar trend? Do you see forces of economic opportunity driving it as well? If I can characterize Ivo's remarks there a little simply, or do you see other forces at work?
I mean, I wrote a book with Michael Green shortly after the 2008 crash, where we talked about why that had happened and what needed to change, and very much making the case that it was toxic ideas as well as toxic assets that were behind the financial crash, and it was an obsession with short-term financial performance. It was an obsession with GDP as the sole measure of whether you were going in the right direction or not, and out of that, I helped found something called the Social Progress Index, which is trying to measure things more broadly in terms of whether we're going in the right direction or not. And I think that, fundamentally there was an opportunity after the crash for the political elite to set out an agenda that was much more about sharing prosperity, because clearly there was a problem that the average family hadn't been prospering in America since maybe the mid-90s. The housing bubble had come out of an attempt to create an illusion of prosperity that really wasn't founded properly. There was an opportunity after 2008 to do that, and instead, very quickly, the global elite got back to the excitement about tech innovation, about getting richer, and there was no political reform. The Occupy movement fizzled out quickly, and people thought, okay, that's gone. We don't need to worry about that anymore. And unfortunately, I think that there are very, very profound breaking points in societies where people really don't trust the elite anymore, and it's not obvious to see a quick path back to restoring that trust, other than really, it won't be quick, long-term efforts to fundamentally get people believing in the American dream or the European dream again, and that's going to require great leadership and the equivalent of the progressive movement at the start of the 20th century. And as you look around, you do see figures like Macron or Trudeau, but they are very exceptional figures, and if you look across who's in elite leadership around the world at the moment. So I am pretty worried about where that's going to come from, let alone people capable of doing the big thinking around innovating around democratic models and multinational cooperation that I think needs to happen.
What about the narrative, this idea that we're living in different information bubbles with a very fractured narrative? Do you put much store in those views and sort of getting back to some common view and alignment around?
Yeah, I do. I mean, there's obviously something going on, which is, it's become much easier to believe your own propaganda and just to put yourself in a place where you're only hearing things that reinforce your own viewpoint. So that adds to the challenge of creating better democracies that actually confront people with real facts rather than fake alternative facts. And it's that's what frustrates me about the technology sector, that it hasn't, although we're starting to see things like crowdfunding and so forth we're starting to see some intelligent curation models, but really that is where we ought to be able to find ways to bring people together voluntarily around interesting policy challenges and to include a lot more people in working towards finding out what answers would work than we're doing at the moment. The technology exists, platforms are being created, but we're not really finding ways to apply them at the moment.
And if I could just follow up with it just for a second, just because the Economist perch is an interesting one in this media landscape, and we seem to have seen, editorial curated content kind of slip from the fingers of major mainstream media outlets into Twitter and all sorts of other sorts of information sources. And yet maybe now it's sort of swinging back. People are hungry for something curated, investigative reporting. Do you see from the Economist perspective innovations in media by traditional media players to try to reclaim narrative territory?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, obviously the biggest challenge is that people have, for the last 20 years, quite got used to the idea of media, good journalism being free, and that isn't a viable business model. And so what's happened since Trump got elected here is that there has been the start of okay, we better pay for this stuff, otherwise we get the fake news we deserve. And, but it's still, no one is paying more than the price of a Starbucks a week for the Economist or the New York Times, which tells you how much priority they give to it. So I feel like there's a long way to go before you're really getting the really high quality journalism that is needed. And there are obviously vast parts of the world that aren't being covered properly, many issues that aren't being reported on properly because ProPublica or whatever, a New York Times investigative unit just doesn't have the capacity to do what could be done. And you look at the evidence that's now coming up about the financing of the Trump empire, for example, how the hell that wasn't properly reported before the election, tells you the dire straits that the industry is in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But this may be a turning point.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Ivo, we switch gears a little bit and maybe come back to security, NATO, and your experiences there, other dimensions. In a context where the U.S.-Europe relationship seems certainly far more uncertain than it did, and it's not at all clear what the Trump administration's exact policy is and where it's going. What do you see as the risks that come in terms of the world, in Europe and the U.S. otherwise, when the U.S. and Europe aren't on the same page?
So, two big risks in some ways. One is the risk of everyone deciding that because there is no longer this community of nations, this Atlantic community that really has existed and thrived for so long, that they turn inward. That, in fact, the answer to the question of how do you behave with regard to your foreign and even economic policies at a national level is to close in and to cut yourself off, to build walls rather than bridges, as the metaphor has it, and that you then move quite quickly into, in order to gain political support, your ability to project yourself outwards is by saying we're better than our neighbors, we're better than the other guy, and you create an enemy profile, which leads to the challenges which we had in the 1910s and 1930s of nationalism leading to conflict, the return to that world. And I think that's not an impossibility. I don't think that human beings have fundamentally changed over the last 70 years. I think it's very easy for skillful political leaders to mobilize nationalist sentiment. I think that's in part what we saw in Brexit. It's in part what we've been seeing here. America First, for those who may not have remember, was the rallying cry of isolationism in the 1930s, by the way, headquartered here in Chicago. And it has a variety of nationalist and anti-Semitic overtones because of its provenance back in the 1930s. And similar sentiment can grow up in Europe or can re-emerge in Europe quite quickly. In fact, it is in places like Poland and Hungary. So that's one possibility. The breakdown of the multinational and multilateral alignments that leads to the renationalization of European politics, and we know where that ends, or at least the challenge of that ending. And the second problem is that at the very time that the United States is starting to raise questions about the nature of the commitment, questions about Europe's commitment to NATO, but frankly also about America's commitment to NATO, we have seen a resurgence of Russia. A Russia that has always wanted to divide Europe from the United States and Europeans from Europeans, is now rising as a major player in European politics and in European security. And the weaker the counteraction is, the stronger Russia's influence will be. And that influence can extend well beyond where it is today. It can extend possibly to the reacquisition of territories that it once controlled, either directly, like the Baltic states, or indirectly, like Central and Eastern European countries. We are in the middle right now. No one is paying too much attention of this kind of strategic competition in the Balkans, where Russia is trying to break up Bosnia, where it's trying to find a strategic alignment with those Orthodox Slavic countries that have long been part of a more closer alignment with Russia. And the United States is nowhere to be found, and frankly, much of Europe is nowhere to be found in that conflict. So those are the two things I worry about. I worry about a Russia that is finding it easier and easier to spread its influence within Europe and its control, and a Europe and the United States that is increasingly turning inward and will rely on nationalism as a means to motivate and mobilize the public. Neither of these are pretty happy outcomes of the current situation.
Building on that, Matthew, what's the perspective in Europe on Russian interference, so-called, and how do you think Russia can be contained, or can it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to exaggerate the Russian interference as a serious political threat to Europe. I think things that might cause Europe to come undone are more internally generated, like the failure to put in place the political mechanisms you need to support the euro if you create a single currency, and things like that. And I also think that Europe, continental Europe, is actually much stronger than Brexit suggests, because Brexit is partly a vote of confidence in Britain as much as it's also a rejection of a reflection of fear and the sort of dissatisfaction that you see here in the election of Trump, because I think Britain never really bought into the political vision of Europe in the way that the continent did. It was more, we thought our economy was absolutely terrible and the only hope we had in Britain was to cling on to Germany and hope they would save us. And now Britain feels much better about its own economy and had never got a political reason to be part of Europe on top of that. But I think Russia, clearly there's energy issues energy dependency issues that are real, but I think they go both ways. Can Russia really afford to be too tough on that, given it needs the revenue from Europe? And there are border issues that are important, but the use of election manipulation using fake news is largely taking advantage of weaknesses at the margin in our own system. I don't see them as fundamentally able to break Europe up in the absence of a lot of other factors at work. Mm-hmm. And they're not the same threat they were during the Cold War. So I think they're obviously more of a nuisance than people thought they were going to be, and they've been much more. It's a lost opportunity where Putin was in 2001. 2002, there was a potential of a real strong positive relationship, which I think is gone forever now, and at least while he's there.
I mean, I think in the European context, there's less of an open question about, say, a Russian role in Brexit or in the Dutch votes. I think, in the U.S., McCain was just saying in the last few days that, he continues to think of Russian interference in the last election, presidential election in the United States, as sort of the first order issue, and it's open.
Well, the question
it's more
is
of an open question. I think.
The thing is, at the moment, we really don't know how deep the conspiracy is, and part of the problem with Trump is that you can believe almost anything, and it's not easy to reject anything. So this is where Mueller is such a good appointment, because I think he does carry the heft and the bipartisan respect to be able to really dig into this and give us all the answers we need, because the thought that you might have a president that is in some deep way in cahoots with Putin, which I still think is highly unlikely, is I think it's more incompetence that has got Trump where he is than treachery. But it remains to be seen, and Muller has got the capacity to actually to give us the answers on that, and that will be hopefully reassuring.
Okay, well, turning towards, let's go back across the Atlantic then, and maybe more optimistic territory.
It's all relative.
It's all relative, but okay. So with Brexit, we now have effectively a more continental Europe, a narrower Europe in some sense. Is that a better functioning Europe? I mean, people forever have been talking about the challenges of Europe acting as one. Is Europe in some sense an easier partner for the U.S. When it's a French-German axis or a simpler collection of countries, or do you think that's more complicated?
Well, I think if there's one sort of positive, I don't want you to all immediately go to the alcohol after this talk. So if there's one positive development, I mean, clearly, just a little story. Merkel, when she came here, Merkel, who was widely seen throughout Europe as a leader, even either a negative or a positive. So in Greece, she's seen as a leader, but not necessarily the most positive forces. But in Northern Europe, she's clearly seen as a leading person in Europe. She's led on the response in Ukraine. So when she came to Washington for her first meeting with Donald Trump, which, as you remember, didn't go very well, wasn't a handshake, which may have been good for her. And she came back, and basically, she and her team were deeply distraught. One, because they didn't think they would have a partner in Donald Trump, which, by the way, has just been reconfirmed in her view. But secondly, because she didn't see a future for Germany. Because Britain can be Britain, and Holland can be Holland, and Italy can be Italy, and France can be France, but Germany cannot be German. When Germany is German, that's not been a very good history. And the entire identity of the country is within a European context. And the threat, not just of the United States walking away from the transatlantic alliance, but Marine Le Pen winning in France and therefore undermining the European part, was very real for them. Because at that point, where does Germany go? Neither transatlantic nor European. So the election of Macron really and truly for her was a liberation. And for Germany was a liberation. And there is now this opportunity that I think she very much sees. It's part of the statement she made over the weekend that got less attention. All the attention was that the United States, you couldn't fully rely on the United States to the same extent as you had before. The other one was, and therefore, Europe needs to take care of itself. And this idea of a Europe of 27, with a Britain that was never really committed to the political vision, maybe the economic, but not the political vision, now having decided to walk away, that a Europe of 27 really is potentially a way to address the fundamental challenges of the continent. It does mean that she has to change direction in economic policy, because she can't get the other part of the 27, Italy, the Greeks and others, to come along unless, in fact, Germany starts acting like the power it is, which is actually providing some of those public goods in the way that the United States has done. So it does require a transformation in German economic policy and political policy. But if they do that, then there is this real opportunity of having a very strong, capable Europe that is working together to protect what it has created. And it will then deal with the United States, hopefully on a friendly and positive basis, but it at least can outweigh what happens here politically in this country. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing for us as Americans. A strong Europe, united Europe, is a good thing. In fact, that's what we've been trying to do for 70 years. And the stronger and more capable it is, the better it is as a partner in addressing some of the challenges that we face together. But even if they're not a partner, it's not a bad thing for them to move in that direction. So I think there's that possibility. It requires, I think, the Germans to understand that they now have to lead in a way that they have never been willing to do for history. But if anybody can do that, Angela Merkel may be the right person at the right time, at least for the next few years.
Yeah, and I think Henry Kissinger's wish for there to be one telephone number is going to come true after Merkel gets re-elected, presumably quite strongly in the autumn, that it will be her phone number. And the question really is whether she has has the capacity to rise above what's been a very domestically focused caution, as well as constrained by this historic German role and sort of identity crisis that it has. Can she rise above that to help lead Europe to do some pretty major reforms? And they could be reforms that also, while strengthening the core, also give more of this sort of flexible geometry of the phrases. And you can almost imagine a certain type of resurgent Merkel offering Britain a different membership of a different sort of Europe that might actually force the Brexit negotiations to be stopped and another referendum to be offered. I mean, if she offers Britain a different deal, a more ambitious deal than was offered to Cameron, who knows? Britain, I just don't sense that the Brexit is, it was a very close result. I don't see it as being absolutely locked in stone, given the difficulty of actually negotiating anything that is remotely as attractive as what Britain currently has. I would also say Brexit, I think there's absolutely no sense that Britain is looking to withdraw from its international responsibilities as a military force. So its commitment to NATO and to be a good partner in international peacekeeping and so forth and enforcement. I mean, Britain is as strongly committed to that as ever before in a way that I don't think people feel as confident in America.
Nor, I think, is London trying to withdraw from being a financial center.
No, indeed.
Which makes me wonder, I mean, if economic forces are a part, it was where we started our conversation, underlying the populism and the sense that people aren't being fully well served, and that's leading to electoral and policy consequences. I mean, some of the economic realities that might come to Britain from Brexit might change people's minds. So Matthew, I mean, do you think a finance company is going to go headquarters in London now, or are they going to Frankfurt? And how much do you see these kinds of questions playing into the evolution of how Brexit plays out?
Well, clearly, I mean, financial firms at the moment are exploring what moving parts of their operation out of London will look like, and moving some small part of it at the moment. I think the great thing about finance is that you don't really have to. It's not like moving a factory. It's easy to move an activity from London to anywhere else in Europe or anywhere else in the world, really. And so I think a wait-and-see approach, will probably be what most firms adopt. And London does have a lot of historic advantages as a financial capital, and it's also, I think, more likely that, or as likely that it will lose business, if it does lose business, to New York or other places than necessarily to any of the European financial capitals. So I think for now it's kind of wait and see. But again, the way the negotiations for Brexit are being started is with this very extreme rhetoric on both sides, which would suggest that maybe even they won't reach a deal, which would be a potentially very bad outcome. And I think you always assume that the tough negotiating stance at the beginning is eventually, watered down into a good compromise. But I think there are certain reasons why, in both the British position and the German positions, might be harder to walk away from than people would think. And so, whilst I think there could be the sort of out-of-the-box gesture by Europe to say, okay, we're reforming in big ways, stay part of it, I also think it's possible, and probably more likely than it ought to be, that we get a really bad negotiation and a really bad outcome.
Hopefully some of the trust we were talking about earlier can help all sides come to a amicable and mutually beneficial separation. I see we're almost out of time. I'm actually just reminded, rather randomly, I was sent a paper this morning. I get sent papers a lot. It's one of the most interesting papers I've ever been sent. It was about the Habsburgs and the Austrian Empire and how they managed to stay in power for so long. And I'm just realizing it's apropos of our conversation, because the answer for the Austrian Empire wasn't military strength, it was marriage. And they were very good at marrying. And this paper basically shows empirically that they basically never went into conflict every time they got to marry off a cousin. And when they didn't, that's where all the conflicts came from. And so I'm reminded of our theme that, in terms of US-European relationships, we seem to have, at least the government level, the marriage is fraught, shall we say, at the moment. But hopefully we can get back to strong relationships that will drive our mutual stability, security, and prosperity. And please join me in thanking both of our Ivo and Nat for great comments.
Happy Habsburgs will simply marry Europe. And this is what you speak of, Ben. Thank you. That was an excellent job. And thank you to all of the panelists. By the way, we have an expanding group called Kin Europe. Our good partners from H-Farm, there's Tomas and Michele, if you can wave your hand, are helping us build Kin Europe. We were in Paris and Berlin this year. Some of us here, Howard, Bob, Karina, were on this trek, so please join us if you're interested. Matthew said it's never been less clear. That's a strong statement. Unfortunately, I think you're right. I love the comment, toxic ideas, not just toxic assets. In fact, if you think about it, we never would have had toxic assets if no one had had a toxic idea. Brexit is not the answer. You heard it here. We'll see what happens. Who knows? We don't know. But someone who has a lot more experience than most of us has a sense that it's not the answer. We'll certainly find out. You also mentioned the tension between values and interests. In a strong sense, I'd propose that values are interests. They're far harder to decipher and support. And how do we find that balance? No party has defined an answer. I think that's true in Europe as well as the United States. And I'd say, Matthew and Ivo, both of your institutions are immensely important at this time of peril. I'm in love with both of the missions of your organizations. Thank you for being here.